Okay, so the way I've been watching a lot of videos, and the way that I see the atheist versus theistic argument, and in some ways this argument lies within each of us, no matter how religious or non-religious we are. It comes down to objective versus subjective, empiricism versus experience, I guess. And what's commonly seen as more firm, right? Atheists tend to stand on a more objective stance and say, well, I just look at the facts. I just look at the evidence as it is. I don't have a bias. I don't layer in some weird story. And I think what we're realizing, or what I'm seeing, is that empirical observation or sense data is not is not as solid as it seems. That I think in this argument there really is no high ground. There's no firm place to stand. Even though I guess it does seem like, if I just look at something and I can point to it and it's the color blue and I show you and it's blue and we can all see the same color, right? And this is kind of how science is built up, that is a somehow more stable view of the world. But actually it's not so simple as that. And here I'll give you an example. You've probably seen this before. It's a pretty famous drawing. Here we see actually two pictures, and it just depends on how you look at the picture. And so then what I might say to you is, well, come on, man, which one is it? Is it a young woman or an old woman? Come on, I thought sense data was stable. I thought you didn't put any bias on the world, that you just simply see it as it is. Well, you see that sense data always requires an interpretation for you to understand it. That you take a filter, a preconceived filter, like a camera, like camera settings or filters on your Instagram posts, like it just depends on what filter you use, and that determines how you interpret the world, how you see the world. So you either see this young woman or you see an old woman. And the troublesome thing is, like, you can't see both. You're always composing from one perspective or another perspective. And there's no way you can be sure that the way you're looking at the world, even though you're just interpreting raw sense data, there's no way you can be sure that you're interpreting it in the correct way, that you're composing it in the best way possible. I mean, here's another kind of an extremer example, more extreme example. Some people call this art. I look at this, it looks like someone spilled a bunch of paint. Um, this painting probably sold for about $1 million, $2 million. This is a Jackson Pollock painting. And it's like, come on, man, I thought you were just looking at the world. I thought that was just art. I thought, some people can look at that painting and through their filter, they're moved to tears. And then there's people like me and maybe most people, I don't know. I'm just like, what the fuck is that? Like, I'm not paying $1 million for that. You're crazy. And so when you take this to the larger pursuit of science, for example, right, which is this bastion of impartiality and unbiasedness, you can see that there's something that happens before science that allows it to become science. So I'll give you an example. Biologists in the 1700s refused to use the microscope, or there was actually a great controversy about whether or not to use the microscope. And the argument was that the microscope interferes with our ability to observe the world. To observe the world truly as it is. The biologists of the 1700s were the most empirical people on earth, probably the most empirical scientists ever, because they refuse to use any instrumentation but their naked eye to make determinations about what a thing is and what it is not. And this is demonstrated, this is noted in Michel Foucault's The Order of Things. So it's hard to imagine that, right? Why would a biologist refuse to use the microscope? That's because their model of the world, their conception of how to observe the world, shaped what kind of data they accepted and what kind of data they didn't accept. And when you think about like how we moved into anatomy and how we started categorizing animals and organisms according to their organic structure, that was not the result of new technology, obviously. They had the microscope, they didn't use it. They've been aware of internal structure since at least the time of the Greeks. I've been reading the Iliad, and let me tell you, when people like cut off arms and legs or stab someone in the lungs or breaks their collarbone, right, during all these war scenes. I mean, he's enumerating in great detail what is happening to these people, as they're getting stabbed, which is kind of awesome. But just to show that they were aware of internal anatomy, but they just didn't see it as something as defining the essence of what a being was, and that didn't happen until the 1800s. So it was not a technology issue, and in fact, they refused technology because their conception of the world, how they saw the world, their sense data, how they valued it, was already generated in them before they even started interpreting the world. There was an interpretation happening already. So another example of that is like, let's say, you know, we're talking. I'm like, yo, man, I met this great girl. Oh my God, I can't wait to tell you about her. You're like, yo, man, tell me about her. I'm like, well, okay, so, when I see her from 3 miles away, I really can't make her out that well. It's amazing. And you're like, okay. And like, like her hair. So she has at least 250 million follicles per 6-inch square towards the crown area of her scalp. I mean, wow, you know? And it's like if we had that conversation, you'd just be like, all right, I mean, okay, is there anything else about her? I mean, in that conversation, we already have an agreement about what information fits within the framework of what we consider important or relevant in that conversation if I'm going to tell you about a person. So we come to the table with a preconceived sense of what data we should be looking at. And I think that happens in this objective versus subjective atheism, theism discussion. Let's say I turned to you and I was like, hey man, let's study fire. I want to study what fire is, what the nature of it is, and here's how we're going to do it, okay? Okay, here are the tools that we're going to use. I brought my tape measure. I figured that should be helpful, right? Studying fire, you obviously need a tape measure. I brought my scale so we can weigh it. I brought a really sharp microphone that measures sound so we can kind of see what kind of noise it makes, right? And then you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like that's not how you study fire. I mean, you have to measure the energy output. You can look at the coloration of it. You can feel the heat on it, right? And what if I was like, what? No, man, dude, I don't trust any of that. I don't trust any of that. No, the only thing that's important here is going to be this tape measure and the scale, and that's how we're going to study fire. And then you'd just be like, okay, well, that how does that make any sense? And so then, like by analogy, if you were to say, like, well, if you're asking these big questions, right, like, is there God, isn't there God? And you say to yourself, okay, well, look, I'm only going to use objective data. Like, I don't want to use any subjectivity. I don't want any weird opinions or personal experience. I'm just going to use this particular set of instrumentation, just objective sense data. I mean, my response is, well, look, first of all, there's no such thing as purely objective data. You are using a preconceived internal structure to interpret your data. And second, you're rejecting an entire field of experience there, that subjective experience. I think what we're going to find progress as we progress in this modern era is that subjective data is going to become more and more valid in the same way that psychology as a field has become valid. So, and that's the endeavor of some of these books, like Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He's taking subjective data, right, just the stories that we tell, and he's saying, wait a second, this story persists throughout every story. Every story has this certain perspective or observation about reality. And so then what do we do with that? So there we go.